However, we can say that in the 15th century, secular educationalists have become unhappy even with this. Increasingly, the approach now is to regard education as, if anything, a vehicle for social progress. Not so much towards class equality, something that has been tried and simply has not succeeded, but towards other forms of equality, such as gender equality, and also the equality of people of different races, different sexual orientations. So modern education can be defined very simply as an acculturation against tradition. It's an explicitly polemical, transformational model of social engineering, despite its expressed opposition to all forms of totalitarian interference with the minds of the young. In fact, it is very programmatic, and its intention is explicitly to deconstruct tradition, to venture into the unknown. Now, this was fine when it was still assumed that we could have an objective definition of man, the modernist, as opposed to the postmodern definition. That definition might well be rooted in psychoanalysis, or it might be rooted in some form of biologism. It might, for residual Marxists, be rooted in ideas of class consciousness. But that idea that modern education has succeeded in framing an objective conception of man now can be seen to have largely receded, creating serious problems for those who advocate programmatic models of social engineering. There is, of course, a great tension between modern epistemology, on the one hand, and ideologies such as traditional difference feminism, on the other hand, or the gay liberation movement. There's a tension there that they're constantly arguing about. So we find in this new period that the idea that life has meaning and the purpose of education is to help us discern and live by that meaning has been progressively abandoned. Despite the importance of compulsory education in modern societies, the objective of education has never been more vague and more negotiable, more relative. So, for instance, Peters, in his famous book, Education as Initiation, almost a Bible for many educationalists nowadays, says, "The great teacher is he who can convey a sense of quality of life to another, so that it haunts his every endeavour and makes him sweat and yearn to fix what he thinks and feels in a fitting form. For life has no one purpose, man imprints purposes upon it." Classic modern, postmodernist, or Heideggerian epistemology. Now, the problem with this is that it still uses words like quality of life. And that presupposes some consensus, or at least clarity, about what a good life might consist in. Can the modern world really define that? What are we here for? Well, religion has stepped away from answering that question, so we have to define it in terms of the good life, perhaps in Aristotelian terms. But what is a good life, and who is a good person? Are there virtues? Do we still speak of virtues in the modern world as opposed to relative values? Clearly there's a diminishing consensus. Hence we can speak of the most profound crisis that the West has ever known in the theory of education. Since the 1960s, and certainly since the beginning of the new Muslim century, there has been a progressive, apparently unstoppable disintegration of values. There is an increasingly mechanistic image of human beings. And we might say that the Promethean project of Western education, which began in the 18th century with people like Burke as a resistance to the certainties of Christianity, has now reached its logical and destructive conclusion, so that the schools are no longer producing men and women of virtue. They no longer claim to do that, because nobody knows what a virtuous person is. All they can claim to do is to produce people who are not socially destabilizing. That's what they hope to do. In reality, they often don't succeed in doing even that. The idea of the delinquent, so unimaginable traditional societies which assumed that one's teenage years were a time of slightly uncertain quietness and submissiveness to one's parents. Nowadays we have an idea of the delinquent who is paradigmatically in revolt against his parents, against religion, against authority, perhaps against the state, against community. So the traditional ideas have been completely inverted, and a new type of product is emerging from the mass education systems of the modern world. The only certainty we do have is, of course, the body. The mind, well, philosophy doesn't really help us to define any certainties, so the mind isn't very helpful. The spirit, abandoned almost completely, except in residually Christian schools, and except in New Age circles, which redefines spirit so radically as to make it almost a different concept, because they have no concept of the ego or nafs. There's no idea that the spirit is something that is held back by the nafs in New Age spirituality. It's all about self-discovery, self-proclamation. It's in fact the inversion of traditional spirituality. But the certainty that they do still have is the body. And it's all about the body. It's all about excelling in sports, that coming ultimately out of the ancient Greeks. The body beautiful. Young people figuring out what cosmetic surgery they're going to pay for, even before the relevant body parts have actually formed. So young kids in England now logging onto websites when they're 10 or 11 to work out what shape they want to have for their bodies, even before their bodies have begun to grow. This is increasingly common and will become increasingly common. The body is the only certainty now. Man is regarded as an extremely sophisticated biological machine. Metaphysics has become myth. So what was tangential has become central, and what was central has become forgotten altogether, and modern education can do nothing whatsoever to stand against that. There may be a few Catholic schools that are fighting a rearguard action, but basically the battle has been lost. And overwhelmingly the model of education in the modern world is about the inculcation of vocational training that will enable us to be useful in the world, and would also perhaps give us some insight into the aesthetic and cultural conditions of the past, although even that is becoming difficult, and young people increasingly find it unimaginable, impossible to imagine what life would have been like even 20 or 30 years ago. The sense of continuity, of empathy with the past, with one's ancestors, has been lost almost entirely.